We want to take a look now at the situation in Ukraine, and we're very glad to have with us Craig Murray, who was a former ambassador, British ambassador, and all sorts of other positions you've held over the years. But thank you very much for joining us now today. I mean, when you read the papers, it just is one view, isn't it? Putin is a madman. There was no reason for the invasion. It's a simple. I mean, we all oppose the invasion. I think we should say that from the start, and I'm sure you do as well. But it is the line that has been pushed in the media was very one-sided. How do you view this conflict?
I think the lack of nuance in the media is very worrying indeed, and the degree of censorship, the lack of any alternative view. Even if you were to take the view that this is a straight conflict between two sides, and that you can only be on one side or the other side, and there's no possibility of nuance. Even if you were to adopt that position, you would still expect the media to reflect both sides at some stage, and they don't. It's as though this were the fight against Nazi Germany. In fact, it's a comparison they often use. Real life is much more complex than the story we're being given universally by the media. And it's possible for several things to be true all at the same time. Among those is it's possible to say that continued NATO expansion and aggression by the Ukrainian government towards Russian speakers within Ukraine helped provoke the conflict. That's true. It's also true that the actual invasion of Ukraine by Russia was illegal. That's also true. And yet somehow you're not allowed to adopt both those positions. To point out any of the discrimination against Russian speakers in Ukraine is apparently to support the illegal invasion and to support war crimes and all kinds of things. Plainly it isn't, but that's the narrative which we get. And there's a huge amount of abuse faced, particularly by mainstream media journalists, abuse by mainstream media journalists attacking anybody who attempts to explain the situation and look at it in a calm and rational light. And of course, all of this deluge of propaganda is aimed at bolstering public support for massive arms purchases, in effect. Massive arms purchases to give arms to Ukraine and keep the war going, but also the idea that we all of the West needs to vastly increase our defence spending. This is all propaganda which benefits nobody but the military-industrial complex. But I would say that people who think that's only on the Western side are also wrong. Russia, too, is a country where the elite feeds its military-industrial complex and interacts with them. There are no good guys in this war on either side, and that's the truth. And we can go into that in more detail, but that would be my opening thought.
Kevin Bean is also joining us. You are a lecturer in international, or you were a lecturer in international relations at the University of Liverpool. How do you see this situation playing out now in terms of there is talk about this is a prelude to World War III. There's something else going on, etc. Do you think? And Putin has been very loud about I will use nuclear weapons if I have to, etc. I mean, we are closer to another world war than we have been for decades. Do you think it's a real threat?
Well, just one small correction. I have taught on some international relations courses, but that wasn't my academic title.
Sorry.
So just to clarify that. Yes, I think that wider context is important, and Craig, I think, has sort of established some of that in relationship to the two blocks, as it were, that are involved, because I think we shouldn't just see this as Russia and Ukraine. Certainly standing behind the Ukraine will be NATO and of course America. And I think that if we look, for example, at the policy direction of the United States, if we look at their strategic documentation And there's been a remarkable consistency, I think, in this since the early 2000s. The sort of strategic position of the United States has been increasingly directed towards what they say is the competitor, the rival competitor of China. So we are starting, if we look at this in a wider geopolitical sense, we have the United States concerned about the rise of China as an economic power. We all remember the type of rhetoric that's used by Trump in the elections. But also if we look at that documentation, strategic reviews all talk about the need to contain China. Initially, that containment was seen in terms of partnership. If you recall, in the early 2000s, the hope was that China could be brought into, quote, the international community, be brought into the World Trade Organization, and that some sort of modus vivendi between an emerging power and the established power of the United States could be achieved. China's expansion, I think, much more rapid than many people thought. I certainly was quite surprised by the rate of economic growth and the way that it developed. Certainly sort of changed that. And also I think there's a sort of a certain continuity in terms of not just containment, and again, Craig will be very familiar with the diplomatic history of America in terms of the Soviet Union, the George Kennan memorandum about the ideas of containment, but then moving, I think, into a much more sort of aggressive and activist phase, not just now moving towards containment, but actually moving towards, some sort of real restraint, possibly even involving military conflicts in Asia. Probably, I think, not necessarily involving the United States directly, but certainly involving various proxies. So Russia, I think, fits into that. It fits into part of that strategy. Again, an area of the world I know that Craig's very familiar with, the old Soviet sort of Far East, the various stans, attempts to sort of extend American and NATO influence in those areas as well. All, I think, give us this view of sort of great powers, lining up. Now, it's obviously not the same situation as in the late 19th century, the early 20th, but I think there are some sort of similarities. And certainly the idea of identifying enemies, identifying China as an enemy, is very similar to the way that the great powers before 1914 identified their enemies. The Germans are identified as an enemy by Britain, Russia was identified as an enemy by Germany. So it's that sort of, I suppose, drive to war which is unprecedented. And for people of my generation who grew up throughout the Cold War, at least from the 50s onwards, this does seem a much sort of tenser situation with the possibilities of real engagement. The fact that a former deputy commander of NATO forces could actually envisage British troops fighting in Ukraine, or even people like Lord Finkelstein writing in the Times about we have to consider the implications of the use of nuclear weapons. All, I think, bring this possibility much nearer. And Craig's talked about the role of the military-industrial complex. The media join in that, and in a sense they soften up is the wrong word, but they certainly make us more prepared to think about these countries as enemies, and also the possibilities of British people being involved directly in these sorts of wars. So I think it is a very serious situation, and one that's not being analysed. It's just being taken as read that this is the way things are going to go.
Theo, what's your take on the situation?
I remember at the breakout of the war, watching people scrambling to get out of Ukraine. And I don't know whether you remember the footage of African people being discriminated against and being made to stay in cold, wet stations while the white people escaped. Now, we don't hear about what's happened to the Africans in Ukraine and whether they are at the mercy of people who, Craig, I believe, wrote about the fascism that exists in Ukraine that we don't hear about. So to say that Ukraine is totally innocent in this, in my opinion, even if you just look at the treatment of African students in that, I think is very wrong.
After the first few weeks after the invasion, it looked like peace was going to happen. Craig, there were peace negotiations, and it seemed the Zelensky government was very close to coming to an agreement when it came to the Donbas region and those other regions where there's a majority support for the Russians. I think that's quite clear. But then something happened, and a further push to war seem to have been going on, and you've outlined there's been like over $50 billion the US government has given to the Ukrainian government. Is this what happened? Do you think, was there a push to continue this and not let up and not sign a peace agreement?
Yes, I actually flew to Ankara where the proximity talks were going on. The Ukrainians and Russians weren't talking to each other directly. They were talking to each other through the government of Turkey. And I flew to Ankara and spent a month in Turkey. I got back 2 or 3 months ago, where I was supporting and, if you like, unofficially advising the Turkish government on those talks. And there's no doubt that the Biden administration made plain that they weren't going to support any peace deal. There was a peace deal in the offing in which Ukraine would agree not to join NATO for 25 years. There would be de facto recognition of Russian ownership of Crimea, or that Crimea was part of the Russian state. And while the Donbass would remain Ukrainian, but the Minsk agreements would be implemented. That was the basic outline of a peace deal. And don't get me wrong, we weren't at the stage even of exchanging texts. It was at the stage of proximity talks with each side. But the Biden administration made it absolutely plain to Zelensky that there wouldn't be, and I think Blinken did that on visit to Ukraine, that there wouldn't be any American support for a peace deal, and that kind of peace deal would result in a cutting of American financial aid and everything else. And so the Americans torpedoed the chance of peace, which is a great shame, because my own view is that at the end of this war, what happens is probably going to be very similar to that. The ultimate, we'll probably end up somewhere not far from that, but just with several 100,000 people dead in the meantime. And certainly I don't think anything better for Ukraine than that will be obtained at the end of this war. So, it's very, very disappointing that was.
So why do you think then, what's your view on why is Biden pushing, apart from, increasing the industrial military complex? What are the other issues there?
Well, they also hope to weaken Russia terminally. They do have this belief, which I think is a misreading, but they do have this belief that Putin can be brought down internally by continued military failure in Ukraine. I think it would have to be a spectacular military failure for that to be a possibility. I don't think that's likely to happen. But they want to, if you like, bleed Russia quite literally. Of course, the Americans don't care how many Ukrainians die in doing that. But there's also an element of revenge, because the Americans are extremely angry about Russia intervening in Syria to foil their attempt to overthrow the Assad regime and replace it with a pro-Saudi jihadist regime, which would have continued to advance the American agenda in the Middle East, and also have tilted back the Sunni-Shia divide in a sunny direction after Iranian influence was increased, strangely enough, by the American toppling of Saddam Hussein. So these are all very, very interlinked. There's an element of there was an element of revenge on Russia, which we shouldn't underestimate, over Syria. But essentially, the Americans are dead set against peace. I mean, the biggest chance for ending this conflict is that China, which economically has got a firm grip on America in many ways, is that China intervenes to stop it. But that would be a much more activist foreign policy than China has shown any signs of taking so far.
So you don't think China is on the radar of the US as a next target, that this is a proxy war of some sort?
I mean, China is definitely very much on the radar of the US. But I wouldn't say that the war in Ukraine is a proxy war on China. I think that's another linked enemy in the rather paranoid worldview of the Biden administration. And on China, I would say I can't think of any other incidents in history where any power has achieved the level of economic domination that China has now achieved without seeking territorial expansion. And China hasn't sought territorial expansion in the last few decades as its economic might has grown and grown and grown. And I think that's an interesting fact. I mean, look at America. Once the United States achieved the kind of economic position in the world that China has now achieved, it immediately started setting up military bases all around the globe. Whereas China has refrained from doing that. And that I think is an observation not sufficiently often made. Anyways.
No, that's very, very interesting. Kevin, on the question of China, and that's the last question because I think we actually got the feedback up now. There's some on the left who say Russia as well as China, they're both not properly capitalist. They are both not properly imperialist. Craig outlined as well, at least China hasn't been expanding recently. Does that mean we should support them if it comes to a conflict between, the US, the big imperialist, and the smaller one, non-half imperialist? Do we have to support one of them, or can we actually oppose both of them? I know actually what your view is, but I would like to hear you say.
I think they are interesting in the case of China, and I think Craig is right to talk about it being an interesting formation. That's an understatement, both in terms of its rapid growth and the nature of it. I don't see it as a socialist state. I mean, there are some people who do see it as, socialism with Chinese characteristics. I certainly don't see it like that. But I do think that as a form of capitalism, it's got some very sort of distinctive features. I think that it is exporting capital, and I don't want to get into too technical a discussion on theories of imperialism. But Craig is right. It's economically expansionist, and historically that usually then involved physical controls over markets and resources, and it is, I think, does have a considerable influence. Belt and Road is an example of that, and even although everybody I think tries to forget it, remember the golden relationship between Britain and China. Drinking pints in pubs in Oxfordshire between Xi and David Cameron. So, that type of sort of expansionism, that type of attempt of influence, is a form of power. I think, though, that politically, and again, I speak as a socialist who sees great power rivalry of that character, and particularly of war, as not being in the interests of working people the world over. Because the point that Craig makes, very important one, is that the people who are going to die in the Ukraine, or indeed in any other of the small wars which have been going on and do go on between great powers, it certainly won't be any of the leaders. It certainly won't be the generals and the arms manufacturers. Although actually in the case of Russia, they do seem to have been rather unlucky when it comes to the generals. So perhaps that's rather different. Being 50 miles behind the front lines might have saved you in 1918, but doesn't seem to do the trick now. But I think that the rivalries are interlinked, and I think that bringing in the Middle East is an important point, because we have to look at this as a world system, and we have to look at the way that the countries of the world, the economies of the world are linked. And that again takes us back to, lessons of history and ideas of the way that great powers will jockey for position and will use, various means and various resources. Sometimes war, which many people thought was a thing of the past, will be a useful instrument. Other times it will be economic power. I certainly think that the United States does want to bleed Russia. Brzezinski's book in the 1990s does talk about that, and the idea of regime change, which you hear American analysts and politicians talk about, and even the possibilities of the disintegration. The Russian Far East is potentially a very important resource area for companies to invest in, and that idea of dismembering Russia or weakening it considerably. I think the interesting point, and I think that is still open, because the recent discussions involving China and Russia. China will, I think, try to mediate and moderate, but it will be in Chinese interests. So, just to conclude, my point is we are in a period of great power rivalry. It's one that looks familiar to historians, but of course it will be the rivalry of the 21st century with different weapons and different ways of fighting, but still the same basic dynamics, I think.
Yeah. We've got Kevin Higgins now with us, who is going to read another poem, and this time it's quite a good subject and a fitting subject on the war. Thank you, Kevin.
Okay, I wrote this poem in the days after the Russian invasion, and it's called The Book of War, and it was almost immediately translated into Russian by a young poet who lives in Dublin, but is Russian and was visiting her parents in Volgograd and was stuck there because she couldn't get back with her family. They were bringing their child to see the grandparents for the first time. The Book of War. The Book of War is busy scribbling itself another chapter, hardly a syllable of which is true. You are in it, given your own continued existence at this point in the story. Though being microscopic, you're not exactly named. Everyone has an opinion, each chicken its own cluck. One vows to abstain from Shostakovich. Another refuses from now on to teach Dostoevsky. Not to be outdone, a third clucks that this morning it tried to send a parcel of AK-47s by registered post. Others want to shoot down planes because that's how peace is made, and the pilots, we're reassured, are only vermin, though obviously the clever sort, if they can fly planes. Radio 4 Women's Hour is instructing its listeners in how to make a Molotov cocktail, of which everyone is suddenly in favour.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Earlier, and we did an improvised session with Craig Murray and Kevin Bean, but we hadn't heard the opposing view, and we actually are quite keen to have a proper debate on these issues. So we said we want to have that debate, especially now with Simon Pirani, who has a different viewpoint from the other speakers we've heard. And unfortunately, Craig Murray had to leave, but we now got Roger to introduce this session. Apologies, and see you later.
Right, hi comrades, apologies for the false start, but here we are. It's hard to remember, but 30 years ago, the world capitalists were celebrating what they called the end of history. But since then, history has given its own riposte in the shape of the deepest slump since the 1930s, the deadliest pandemic since 1918, the most rampant inflation since the 1970s, and the most imminent threat of nuclear Armageddon since 1962. And that's before we even begin to consider the fact that the world is hurtling towards ecological catastrophe. The Ukraine war is the first major war involving a nuclear superpower since 1945. A war certainly shakes things up. The shock of the First World War toppled the dynasties of Europe and precipitated a wave of revolutions. But its first casualty was the Socialist International, which it shattered into fragments. And this war, too, has opened up sharp and sudden rifts among fellow socialists. And we're proud to host here an open forum in which we can debate these crucial differences democratically. Now, I'm sorry to say that we were going to have Richard Brenner and Craig Murray on our platform, and both would have added a lot to the debate. But because of the logistical problems, I'm afraid they're not available now. But we do have, we're very happy to have Simon Pirani, who's a Labour movement activist, a writer on Russia, Ukraine, and energy systems, and honorary professor at the University of Durham. And we also have Richard Sakwa, former professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent, honorary professor in the Faculty of Political Science at Moscow State University, and author of several books on Russia and Eastern Europe. And before asking them to open the debate, I'd like to invite our audience to consider two relevant quotations. The first comes from the USA's former CIA director and former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, who has declared, quote, that the USA, backed by the whole of NATO, is in a long proxy war with Russia, with Ukraine as the battlefield. And the second is by Vladimir Putin, who has dismissed Ukraine's very national identity as an artificial construct created, as he put it, by Bolshevik communist Russia, adding the menacing message, "We are ready to show you what genuine decommunization means for Ukraine." So the questions are, is Russia turning the clock back to recreate a prison house of nations, as Lenin described the Tsarist Empire? And is the USA using the Ukraine war as a stepping stone towards a coming world war with Russia and China? And where should socialists stand in this conflict? Simon?
Okay, thank you, Roger. Thanks for inviting me to join the panel. I'm sorry we had these technical difficulties. I want to just reflect very quickly on what good panels like this or gatherings like this can do. I'm speaking slightly into the ether. There's a live stream, I understand, and people can watch this subsequently on the internet. If I say something you don't like, or you do like, I have a blog. It's People Nature, all one word, peoplenature.org. You can email me there. I'm very happy, and there's a lot there about what I think about Ukraine, and I'm very happy to correspond with people. I mean, the reason I've joined today is because I think that we have to find ways of discussing what are very deep and serious differences on life and death issues. I mean, I've got 5 points here I was going to make. I'll adapt them slightly in the sense that the panel has changed. I'm kind of generally aware of Richard's view. I've known him for many, many years. He was very supportive to me when I was doing my studying, but now we don't have the other panelists. So the first point I want to make is about the character of the Russian war. In my view, Russia is a weakened empire desperately trying to restore its imperial status. It emerged from the breakup of the Soviet Union as an economically subordinate power, supplying the world capitalist economy with raw materials and pumping oligarchs' wealth into the financial system. Under Putin since 2000, it sought to make up for economic weakness by military means. In the Second Chechen War, Russia pulverized Chechnya and its population rather than allow aspirations for national autonomy or independence to take root. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008 and, of course, intervened in Syria to support a dictator who drowned citizens in blood rather than allow them democratic freedoms. Now, the strongest imperialist powers basically tolerated all of this, and despite their denials, essentially had Russia act as a gendarme of capital in its sphere of influence. Russia's pretensions to imperial status have been most evident in its interventions in Ukraine. It's one of Russia's oldest colonies. Denying Ukrainian national rights was always integral to Russian imperial thinking. And of course, there's the speech that Roger referred to, claiming that historically Ukraine is not a nation. I think the other way of looking at this is that the imperialist character of Russia's war is evident from the military methods used. This is an imperialist force seeking to subjugate an enemy population. Putin said Russian soldiers would be greeted with flowers. There's not a single recorded case, but there are plenty of examples of Ukrainians trying to resist the Russian army with their bare hands. There have been massacres of civilians, rape used as a weapon, torture, forcible conscription, forcible deportation, all methods perfected by the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, as was the method of forcing into the army men from the poorest regions, disproportionately from ethnic minorities. The targeting of politicians, journalists, and activists in occupied areas seems a bit more like the US empire in the 20th century. I recommend the 2 reports on violations of human rights law by the OSCE. They spare no detail on alleged war crimes by Ukrainian soldiers, particularly against those accused of collaboration with Russia. They also conclude, however, that the vast majority of war crimes have been committed by the Russian side, the vast majority. All this makes nonsense of the claims by some people in the labor movement that this is a war between 2 equal sides. Why in February did Ukrainians, whatever their dissatisfaction with their own government, and I can assure you there was plenty, volunteer in large numbers? In my view, it's because they are resisting an imperialist assault, and therefore the labor movement should provide practical, material solidarity to working class communities that are bearing the brunt of this assault. Trade unionists from the UK, France, Austria, and other places have organized convoys of aid to workers in the frontline areas. I would ask everyone here whether they support such initiatives. And do you agree that Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves with arms? I do, in the same way as I believe that Palestinians faced with apartheid Israeli occupation have that right. The second point is about NATO, because obviously it's NATO that is currently supplying the Ukrainian government with weapons and will continue to. In their view, their gendarme has gone rogue and needs to be brought back under control. But that weapon supply, like the applications by Sweden and Finland to join NATO, are results of the invasion, not causes. The idea that NATO expansion was the cause of the invasion is one-sided false logic. An honest assessment of Russia's relationship with NATO would show that that expansion into Eastern Europe belongs essentially to the 1990s, that point of Russian weakness. The last big group of East European countries applied to join NATO in 1999 and actually joined in 2004. The Russian state, buoyed by the oil boom of the 2000s, since then sought to increase its control over its sphere of influence with little interference by the NATO powers. And you could look, for example, at the character of the sanctions imposed in 2014 in respect of Crimea. They were certainly damaging, very damaging to Russian business, but it was essentially a Kremlin decision to subordinate economic management to nationalist and imperialist aims. Analytically, I would define Russia as a creature of the larger powers and a creature of capitalist crisis, and not as an opposite to them. The third point is about proxy war, because the false claim that NATO expansion was the chief cause of the war is linked to the false proposition that Ukrainians are fighting a proxy war for NATO. So the Future of the Left website says, quote, Putin is no friend of the working class, but neither are Zelensky or NATO. Although the direct fighting in Ukraine is between the Russian and Ukrainian states, no mention there of the Ukrainian population at all, many see this war in effect as a proxy war between Putin and the US. Now, this false logic could be applied to any number of situations. Spain in 1936, you could say, quote, Franco's, this is me making up the quote, this is not a quote from anybody, but it's the way this approach could look in Spain in 1936, quote, Franco's no friend of the working class, but neither are the Republican government or the Allied powers. Although the direct fighting is between nationalists and Republicans, many see this war as one between the Axis and the Allies. No room for the international brigades there. Vietnam in 1972, quote, again, made up quote, the US is no friend of the working class, but neither are the Soviet and Chinese leaders. Although the direct fighting is by the Vietnamese army, many see this as a proxy war between Moscow and Washington. Little need to support Vietnamese resistance from that standpoint. To my mind, the difference is that in Ukraine, we're dealing with Russian imperialism, not German, American, or British imperialism. And in the labor movement, we see a bogus Western-centered form of anti-imperialism, in quotes, people who believe crudely that the main enemy is US imperialism and my enemy's enemy is my friend. This thinking is ruinous to international solidarity, just as ruinous as the support given by elements in the labor movement to Tony Blair's imperial adventure in Iraq. It just serves the Kremlin. So a final point is about the so-called republics in the Donbass. A key claim of Kremlin propaganda was that the invasion in February was motivated by a desire to defend Russian-speaking Ukrainians from Ukrainian nationalism. On one level, we could just say that the sincerity of that can be judged by the number of Russian-speaking Ukrainians that the Russian army have killed, raped, and driven from their homes. But I think we need to deal with the claim a bit further. It's still made, and we hear echoes of it in the labor movement. We need to look back far further than 2014, but for now, let's at least look that far back. We had the Maidan uprising, a truly mass movement, politically confused and complex, but directed above all against the government of Viktor Yanukovych and the Party of Regions, which represented Eastern Ukrainian capital, the owners of mines, steelworks, and other industries. That party spared no effort to sow division between Ukrainians on the basis of language, and in response to the Maidan uprising, that party encouraged the anti-Maidan movement that sought autonomy for Eastern regions and had support from substantial numbers of working class people. Right-wing Ukrainian nationalism stoked these divisions from the other side, but these tensions were turned into military conflict by the Russian army fighting alongside extreme Russian nationalist and fascist volunteers. They put in place the two republics, under which the economy of those areas was trashed and half the population left. Tin pot dictatorships were established without the most elementary observance of civil or labor rights. There's an analogy with Ireland. Working class Protestants long formed the support base not only for orange political parties, but for armed loyalist paramilitaries. Traditionally, socialists understood that the power underpinning all this was British imperialism. We did not parrot calls for a unionist six-county state or pretend that working class attitudes to that state weakened the case for a united Ireland. We called for troops out. I've got some more points about the labour movement response, but I think you're trying to keep it brief. So I'll end by saying that as things stand in the labour movement, this bogus anti-imperialism is undermining the internationalist principles on which Chartists supported Irish liberation in the 1840s, and on which many of us here supported Vietnamese liberation in the 1970s. And it's those principles of internationalism that should guide labour movement action now with regard to Ukraine.
Oh, thank you, Simon, for a very forthright and also succinct presentation of your point of view. Richard.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much, Simon, for a powerful and presentation there. I was going to take a slightly different tack. So just to say, of course, glad to be part of this discussion, which I think is absolutely essential for us to discuss these things in a civilized, rational manner. And clearly, if we're talking about in the framework of the future of the left, these issues are fundamentally important, as we've just heard. It is obviously any left has to be far more than just simply electoral victories. It has to be based on underpinned by a clear foundation of ideas. And the ideas, one which I want to focus on today, is the notion of anti-militarism. And I agree with Simon that we do need a more theoretically developed vision of anti-imperialism, and not simply knee-jerk condemnation of one side or the other. But the idea for anti-militarism, I think, can provide a useful intellectual foundation to develop ideas, because obviously this debate is taking place in the framework of for a long time, since 2014 at least, we've been talking about a second Cold War, and that the second Cold War has now moved into a new phase, which is, you could argue, the foothills of the Third World War. And obviously we have an ethical responsibility to avert further escalation, and that's the spirit and the framework in which I make my comments. And so this anti-militarism is the framework. Is astonishing how, in the last few years, how the center of gravity of thinking has moved so far to not to the left, but not even simply to the right, because the right itself, interestingly enough, has been able to generate a critique which in some ways has been more convincing and certainly more powerful than the left in condemning the militarism, which in my view, has been at the basis of this conflict at the moment. That in the United States, for example, traditional national interest group or interest conservatives are now paradoxically far more critical of the militant universalist politics of the Atlantic powers than most of the modern left. And worse than that, the leftist ideas of peace movements and so on have been a particular target of criticism of those who look to some sort of military solution to this crisis at the moment. So the moderate left is now firmly in the liberal interventionist neoconservative primacy camp. This is a disastrous, both politically and, in my view, also intellectually. So how did we get there? So basically, I'm arguing that we have a political West took shape during the Cold War. That this political West, its instruments obviously are NATO and a whole economic paraphernalia, which I won't go into, but this is based on and also hub and spoke alliances with in Japan and in Asia. So it was this political West that Gorbachev during Perestroika tried to change, and this is what the new political thinking was all about. So in other words, this political West is different from the cultural and civilizational West, but it's a political West, very specific form of a US-dominated alliance system with all sorts of positive values within that, progressive values, but ultimately a type of militarized body. And for example, this is, Michael Glennon, for example, has done this excellent work on the dual state in the United States, where he says that during the Cold War, the Trumanite state, the one that condemned by that communist Eisenhower in his farewell address when he condemned the military-industrial complex, that this Trumanite state was effectively overshadowing the Madisonian states. That's the Madisonian state. That's the instruments of popular democracy, elections, representation, free media, and all the rest. And so that this militarized state has been able to shape the discourse and the debate and so on. This is what 1989 was initially about. Gorbachev sought the transformation of this to say that the end of the Cold War would mean a transformation of this political West, keeping the good things, but to end its militarized vision of international order. And of course, in Gorbachev's obituaries, just in the last few weeks, it's been astonishing how his transformative agenda, and I'm summarizing very briefly, has been completely forgotten, instead of which it was all the talk of how he led the collapse of the Soviet Union and the peaceful end of the Cold War. His absolutely radical vision of this new post-Cold War order was completely forgotten and suppressed. And it's astonishing to do so. So this is the Gorbachev such like. So what was this transformation? The whole appeal was that in 1945, we established what I call the Charter International System, based on the UN, based on sovereign internationalism. Instead of which, after 1989, instead of this sovereign internationalist vision, this is the vision and articulated in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, just recently restated in the Samarkand Declaration in December, when meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization leaders with the BRICS and so on, and the Global South, which very much in keeping with the Bandung Declaration and so on. So there is an anti-imperialism out there, which is very powerful, very effective, but very much suppressed in the heartlands of capitalist modernity, and including now, astonishingly, by the left itself, which is really astonishing. So what we're talking about was a return to those fundamental principles of sovereign internationalism, which are embedded in the UN Charter. Instead of which, and that was what Gorbachev allowed the whole end of the Cold War, by appealing to these Charter international system principles, instead of which we got this political West claims it intervenes. It claims to have been the victor in this. Of course, Russia and China and many other states, India, are not going to be happy with this. So it's quite clear that this was a complete travesty of what Gorbachev was trying to do. And the specific, NATO enlargement is both important, and on the other hand, it isn't. Because on the one side, clearly, it isn't just Putin opposed to NATO enlargement. It was Yeltsin, of course. In December 1994, he condemned the Cold Peace in quite violent terms. They assumed that partnership for peace would be the way forwards. And the idea of NATO enlarging against all the promises at the time of German unification. However, even NATO enlargement may have been fine for all sorts of good reasons, stops conflict between its members, above all Greece and Turkey and so on. But even one of the most ardent partisans of NATO enlargement, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in his grand chessboard, said, of course, NATO enlargement must be accompanied, he says, by an overarching security framework so that Russia does not get excluded. And so many other writers also who were very concerned, Kennan and even William Perrier, former US defense minister, and so on, have always argued you needed an overarching framework. So today, within the absence of transformation, we saw the subversion of the autonomy of the Charter international system. And it's taking place in a way in which they create, an alliance for democracies, for a discussion now for G12, the United States and its allies, to act as a substitute for the autonomy of international law and of the Charter international system. So that's the context in which this conflict took place. And so to talk about Russian imperialism, yes, I agree with Simon quite strongly there, that in all sorts of ways, the development of Russia in the last few years has been deeply pathological and especially intensified after 2019, after the Moscow Duma elections and the repression and so on. But if restoration of empire at that point was the key idea, then in 2014, as many of the nationalists called for, then they mean far more than just simply Crimea. It doesn't help explain why, for so many years, Moscow was trying to have the implementation of the Minsk II agreement for the Donbass, which was a formula for their restoration and return to Ukrainian sovereignty, which in my view was absolutely the right way forwards. Obviously, it would have meant a transformation of the Ukrainian state. But this transformation from external, obviously the elite didn't like it. But this transformation would have been something which I've been calling for since 1996. And that is that when I saw that 1996 constitution, Ukrainian constitution, it was almost unbelievable that it presented itself as a monolingual, ethnicized state, a la Estonia or Latvia. Absolutely shocking development. And this is, of course, has been generating conflict ever since. Now, it's absolutely right that, and under the pressure of invasion, people, everybody from all, whatever nationality, whatever group, have rallied to the legitimate state. And so it's quite understandable, of course. And, rallying to its defense is quite normal. But that doesn't take away the fact that the Ukrainian state has been developing for the last since the mid-1990s, in repudiation of its very fundamental declaration of state sovereignty in 1990 as a neutral state, as a tolerant, pluralistic state. Yes, it accepted and gave citizenship to all of its members in 1991. But after that, the state project was effectively hijacked we have many other countries, Canada, Wales, many others, multilingual, multicultural, to take joy in its diversity. Instead of which, after the Maidan, whatever you want to call it, coup pollution, revolution type coup, you have quite clearly a virulent nationalist, ethnicized form of state building has developed, of course, alienating people. I've spoken to, and one shouldn't take away the subjectivity of the citizens of the Donbass, leaving aside the Crimea. I've spoken to many people in the Donbass. Books would show it that, yes, of course, rather unpleasant authoritarian systems there, but overwhelming support for this vision. Initially, certainly a vision. They didn't want separatism. They were autonomists of a vision of a pluricultural, multilingual, constitutionally entrenched federal system, or elements of it. It doesn't have to be federal as such, in Ukraine. So again, there were a lot of tensions involved in it. And let me just finish to say, what sort of pathways for peace are we talking about now? If we are in the foothills of the Third World War, what do we do? Okay, more military aid to Ukraine. Well, where does that end? What is the goal? Is it to liberate not just the parts occupied since the 24th of February, but does this mean Donbass as well and Crimea? Well, this is absurd. And Crimea has been part of it. Overwhelming majority of the Crimean population wants to be with Russia. Of course, I'm not endorsing the way it took place in 2014, but if given state breakdown at that time, it's understandable. So also, what are the limits? A word about sanctions, intensification of sanctions. We have never seen sanctions of this form before. We're talking about holding a whole nation collective in terms of collective guilt and collective punishment. Always when there were sanctions in the past, even Iraq, Iran, and so on, the discussion was not to harm ordinary people. The absolute unlimited, total nature of these sanctions, they now calculate up to 10,000 of them. And there's endless talk of yet more and more and more. Is this really what we want? Is this what any normal left movement would say, that this the militarism, military escalation, economic warfare escalation, and no serious path? So the goal, what? Defeat of Russia? Well, maybe it will be defeated. Regime change within Moscow? Well, we may wish for it, a more democratic, post-imperial formation, but they're now talking even of an post-colonial Russia. Let's break it up into 35 different statelets. So, in other words, it's this extraordinary unlimited, total nature of the demands is almost clinical insanity, in my view. Clinical insanity, that we're in the foothills of a third world war. Okay, let's put yet more fire. Let's put more fuel on this flame. Let's fight this. This isn't to say that Ukraine, we always wanted it, a sovereign, democratic, free Ukraine. That was the goal. That was on offer for so long. They messed it up. We messed it up. Russia messed it up. So it's a march of folly on all sides, as I argued in a paper earlier, on all sides, and therefore behooves us, I think, those of us who want to have a vision of free societies developing in partnership, is to support that. So we really have to, it's not, and it isn't a question of punishing the Russian people. Absolutely, it's damaging. It will probably survive. But also, don't forget also the global south in all of this. I've mentioned Shanghai Cooperation, the BRICS and others. This is yet another war of the global north, a civil war in itself, like the First World War, Second World War. It's as if we can simply not get beyond our own, this is our Eurocentric, into endless intra-imperial wars. We need to move beyond all of that. So we need an agenda which can get beyond it. And the only way to do it is to defend the autonomy of the UN-based Charter International System established in 1945. Not special rules-based orders or special subgroups who claim to speak for behalf of all of humanity. We have this Charter International System. It is under the gravest threat since it was established in 1945. We need to go back to its fundamental principles, including dialogue and diplomacy, which has already been undermined well before the Ukraine crisis, but now completely devastated. The world faces a challenge in a moment of danger which it has not seen since 1945. And we really need to step back, de-escalate, demilitarize, and think of how we can then go back to these fundamental charter ideas, which include, of course, human rights, sovereign development, and respect for diversity. Thank you.
Well, thank you to Richard for a very clear and informative statement of your position. Look, we have just 15 minutes left of the session. I think if we have any quick questions or quick comments from the disappointingly small audience who are here at the moment, but I hope that there's a lot more on the live stream or who will be watching this on recording online later. John, Steve, or Jackie, do you want to speak? Do you want to say anything? John, you're muted, John.
Only to say I'd welcome the opportunity to hear more from two very well-informed speakers who've managed to avoid the usual cliches which are characterised by this debate. So, yeah, I think I would welcome some more exchange.
I too. Steve or Jackie? Or anybody else out there? Steve, you're muted as well.
Yeah. Just to say, I'm largely in sympathy with what Simon said. I'd like to say, as might be my position, I support, first of all, as far as this, the Ukrainian working class. I support the idea of an independent Ukraine as a democratic and social republic. It isn't a democratic and social republic. It isn't that. It is being essentially a republic of oligarchs, dominated by oligarchs. I obviously oppose the partition of Ukraine, and I oppose the annexation of any part of Ukraine by Russia. But I also recognise it's an inter-imperialist situation between Russia and America. And in that sense, we support the Ukrainian working class. We don't support the American or British interventions in that war. And in fact, if we were to oppose our own ruling class, the best thing that we could do to stop this situation would be to deal with our own undemocratic system, the fact that we don't have in this country a democratic and social republic. So I think that we have to oppose our own ruling class whilst fundamentally supporting the Ukrainian working class and all the rights, civil liberties, free speech of the Ukrainian working class. And that doesn't put us at odds either with the ordinary people of Russia, by the way, because they've been led into this to back Putin because they've been kept in the dark or repressed. So I think, supporting the Ukrainian working class, supporting the Russian working class, and opposing our own ruling class, its war efforts, and probably selling arms probably and providing weapons and all those other things which it's doing. And of course, America's the big player in this, but Britain, we're not living in America, we're living in Britain. So in a certain sense, we should be criticising our own ruling class and its role in this. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Steve. Jackie, do you want to speak? Are you there? Okay, well, comrades, look, there's only 10 minutes. I think we must ask Simon and Richard if they want to have a last word. Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. I mean, look, the first thing is I hope that this conversation continues, and I would like to find a format whereby that can happen. So let's set that as a modest aim for ourselves. I think it's regrettable that there's no Ukrainian labor movement voice, but if we're going to be on Zoom, that's entirely possible to organize. And in fact, of course, since February, there's been a constant stream of Russian labor movement and other dissident activists who are now far flung around all the European capitals. And, again, if we're on Zoom, there's no reason why we wouldn't be able to get those people into a conversation. So I think this must continue. I mean, just a few quick responses to Richard's points. You're hanging a lot on the idea that the Western push in the 1990s, and then, of course, centrally, the war on Iraq in 2003 was a travesty of Gorbachev's vision. But I don't recognize your Gorbachev. I mean, Gorbachev was very much, was forced to do what he was doing. He was very much a victim of circumstance, and whatever vision he had was secondary to the huge objective changes that were taking place at that time. And I think there are arguments similar to yours which say that, the West had a golden opportunity in the 90s that it could have supported a much more liberal form of power in Russia. But, all that assumes that capital would not inevitably and sort of without anybody pushing it would suck everything it could out of the former Soviet space in terms of stolen wealth, in terms of capital flight in the 1990s, and that an oligarchical setup with a new version of the very, very strong Russian state would be imposed. And of course, the victims of that were in Chechnya, which was a war which was fully supported actually by the NATO powers. So I think it's nice to dream about this Gorbachev's vision and the fact that it was trashed. But we have to deal with the capitalist world that we're actually living in. I could not disagree with you more strongly than when you say that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization represents some sort of anti-imperialism. As somebody who's always thought of myself as an anti-imperialist, it's not an anti-imperialism that I would want to embrace. I think there are many movements in the global south and that we socialists in the global north should support, but I just don't see this collection of states in that part of the world as being one of those. Two last points. First of all, I think you're laying it on a bit thick in relation to the Ukrainian constitution and the direction of Ukrainian statehood. I mean, in the 1990s, the Ukrainian state was a mess, and the predominant approach, which was perfected by Leonid Kuchma, was to balance between Europe and Russia. And that balance was then disrupted by the Orange Revolution of 2004, by and then the election of Yanukovych, and those divisions in Ukraine began to deepen. But I don't recognize this. I don't recognize your view that the predominant trend was to establish this monolingual state. I mean, I recognize that there were Ukrainian members of parliament going right back through that whole period who used the language issue, especially at election times, to try to play on those divisions, as fascist and divisive forces all across the world do. But I don't recognize that had any significant impact. Of course, there's now been a language law passed under Zelensky under the pressure of this new stage of conflict, and it's a law that, I mean, all the Ukrainian friends I know in the labor movement don't like. It's also a law that, like many laws in Ukraine, not everybody pays an awful lot of attention to. That's not to minimize the seriousness of those divisions. It's to say that it's to underline the point that the last thing it needed to deal with those issues was the Russian army and the extreme nationalists, the Chechen volunteers that came with it in 2014. The last point is about sanctions. If anybody from Iraq or Iran is listening online, I don't think they would agree with you that there was no collective punishment inherent in those sanctions. I think there was. I think there's an element of that, because again, that's the way capitalism works. There's an element of that in the current sanctions. And I think that the labour movement can develop, and there have been some efforts to try to develop an independent view of the sanctions issue. I mean, we know where we'd start in the UK. We'd start with oligarchs' money, which still kind of comes and goes pretty much, not entirely unobstructed since February, but they still, find ways around the barriers and still feel themselves very much at home in, I was going to say Boris Johnson's London. Of course, the guard has changed for the moment. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Simon. Richard.
So on the final point, maybe I put it badly. Of course, there was collective punishment in Iran, and there still is, and Iraq earlier. I just meant that these sanctions were accompanied by the need not to avoid to damage the civilian population, and it's just simply the rhetoric of that is missing now. So I agree with you completely on that. As for the model of Ukrainian statehood, you're absolutely right again that it was a mess in the 1990s, that multi-vectorism was the Leonid Kuchma approach, which I also condemned, because multi-vectorism was like a weather vane politics, swinging back to one side or the other depending on where this wind was strongest. What I was certainly calling for was a principled position, and to go back to the statement of the Declaration of State Sovereignty, which was Ukraine to develop as a neutral state, just like Austria, Ireland, and many other, Cyprus, many other states. It was not. It's a noble position. It's not a failure not to be neutral, and so that's the first thing that this multi-vectorism, neutrality should have been developed far more positive, positive neutrality rather than just simply, moving between Russia and the West, as it were. But more than that, you're absolutely right, of course, that the harshness of the laws is mitigated by the fact they don't apply them. But what I'm looking at is the theoretical level, the 1996 Constitution, and of course all the debates, and of course under Kravchuk earlier, that the failure right from early on, and I've been having this debates for 30 years with people. Yes, Russian language was, most of the media, lots of the television was in Russian, and so on. Yet, for example, I was teaching in Dnipropetrovsk, as it used to be called, in the early 2000s, and over in Dnipro, as it's now called, overwhelmingly Russophone part of the country, and yet we were not allowed to teach and work in Russian. Now, I'm in favor, and I've always been strongly in favor of the development of the Ukrainian language, that I think it should have been compulsory, and it should be compulsory to be taught up to a certain level. So we're not simply, privileging the former language of Afghan, but, Russian language was not just something which was imposed from outside. It was the language of the people in the south and the Donbass. So it's not as if it was imported. It was, if you were going to take the territories as were given in 1922 by Lenin to this Ukrainian state, then, part of that deal would be you risk the rights of the people who you were given, as it were, transferred without their permission and without their questioning back in 1922, a point which Putin makes in a way which I certainly don't endorse. But the substance of it is not a Putinite idea. It's an idea which we've been discussing for a long time. And what I find so disturbing is that so often even the open discussion of these issues is delegitimated. Are you just being a pro-Soviet, pro-Kremlin, I'm not saying you're saying that, but, the fact that these debates are, they should have been open. And when I did put this forward in my book in 2015, Frontline Ukraine, when I did say, Russia, the ethnic vision of Ukrainian development can at its best be generous, open-hearted, and it's certainly been very tolerant, Jewish and other people. So that's, I accept that. I understand it. I even understand the nationalist impulse to build a state after, years of neocolonialism and whatever you may say. But the fundamental question, which I've been saying for 30 years, means that this language rights should have been constitutionally entrenched. And so when I was in Peturovsk, I said, look, we were all speaking Russian, but it was against the law. And so people, it's just insane way of developing it. And so that was false. And it has generated tensions more and more. And when you argue that the Russian people have been kept in the dark, plenty of stuff kept in the dark, I accept that as well. But on the whole, I've been there talking to people. There is a sort of grim determination that, this is something which has been foisted on Russia by this militarism, by this unmitigated enlargement of the political West after the end of the Cold War. And let me just, final point, to go back to Gorbachev. I understand what you're saying there, but Gorbachev's vision wasn't just Gorbachev. It was the idea, which to this day is fundamentally important to any left anti-imperialism and anti-militarism, is to say, look, we have an international system, the one established in 1945. Let's make it work based on sovereign internationalism. This is where the Shanghai Cooperation Organization comes in as well. Let countries find their own destinies, their own paths to development and modernization, not simply being dominated and said there's one path of modernity. It's a very good path, the Western path of modernity, in all sorts of ways. It is progressive and very positive, leaving aside the economic capitalist issue. But, on the other hand, it is, there's other paths, the Chinese paths to modernity. We may criticize it as much as we like, but the whole point is that sovereign internationalism. Anyway, it looks like we have to end. So thank you for the discussion.
It's been a fantastic discussion. I wish it could go on longer. I wish more people had been able to contribute. I hope that it's that the live streaming has worked properly. And I hope very much that the recording is available and that will be watched by many people. I think it's been a really very, very useful discussion. I thank both the speakers and everybody who has taken part. Thank you, comrades.